The third annual Moot was held over the weekend of the 16th to 17th of June 1979 at the Assembly Rooms, Glastonbury. It was quite simply the largest gathering of lay hunters ever, with over 250 people there at times. Being a weekend event, it was the longest so far held, and was a great success both in terms of attendance numbers and content. No moot goer could be in any doubt as to the explosive exponential growth of the subject and its expansion into many fields of inquiry. Diverse researches and opinions were attracted to the event as by a magnet, to be pooled, compared and analysed by the lay hunting community. The mix was a heady one, combining painstaking grassroots research with deeply inspirational thought. The necessity for this combination was stressed by Paul Devereux in his talks on recent developments in the field, and the Moot certainly lived up to this ideal. Perhaps the main memory of the event was the stunning beauty of the prehistoric system in all its aspects, observable today even in spite of widespread destruction. Implicit, though never quite coming to the surface, was the concept of constant self-renewal in the system, in various forms, yet with a basic consistency. The existence of churches on leys, in far greater numbers than Gregory's edict could produce, is evidence for this, and the process continues today. This further deeper implication of the basic rightness of the lay system, and even perhaps of consciousness of some kind within it, came over strongly, though was never directly alluded to. No better setting than Glastonbury could have been chosen for this event. The place shed its subtle, undefinable magic over the whole proceedings, and the diverse threads of our subject were drawn together and woven into a cloth that will be hopefully as strong as it is beautiful. It will be remembered as a crossroads and mark point in the history of our subject, where alignments of the mind met, mingled and poured out their energies for the enrichment of all present. No one who attended could have gone away with any doubt as to the worthwhile nature of the Moot, or moots in general, in the pooling and spreading of information about leys, in the comradeship fostered between lay hunters, and simply in the indefinable Moot experience itself. Paul Devereux, the editor of the Ley Hunter, welcomed us and revealed that it was somewhat of a shock to see so many faces, but was glad to know people wanted to meet and become involved. He thought the Moot may prove to be a milestone in the whole subject area. We were reminded that we were celebrating not only 58 years of lay hunting, but also 10 consecutive years of the Ley Hunter publication. It was appropriate that this year, 1979, was going to prove to be a vintage one in our subject. Paul continued, "At some point since Moot 78, a real sense of destiny has crept into what we're all doing. We're into something much bigger than any of us appreciate. If you think I'm exaggerating, wait till the end of the weekend, and I'll be surprised and very disappointed if you don't see or sense the outlines of far-reaching implications that are beginning to emerge from the very latest research in the Earth Mysteries area." Ley hunting was leading us to the brink of a new network of understanding. Paul concluded by quoting from an article written by John Michel 12 years earlier. Its centre, Michael's Tower on Glastonbury Tor, overlooks the centre of resistance today, the stubborn town where the new light must blaze before the mysterious giant goddess is awakened. If the light can be kindled there, it will shine as from a lighthouse across the land. He hoped that this gathering would set that beacon alight. Paul Screeton, editor of the Ley Hunter from 1969 to 1976, then spoke on the history of ley hunting and why the Ley Hunter was first produced. Paul had been writing a book on the history of ley hunting, helped by the recent 2-month-long strike of provincial journalists. He had come to the theory that the major people who have been involved in this subject have brought their thoughts and professions, not applying them to it, but taking the subject to different directions, helping it develop and mature. Paul then showed how this idea applied to some of the main workers in the field over the years. Alfred Watkins, for example, was a businessman who saw the leys primarily as trading routes. Ken Coop, who was a professional surveyor, saw them as an early form of survey. Tony Wedd, who'd been an RAF pilot and who had seen a flying saucer during the war, linked leys with the lines that flying saucers were thought to follow. Paul mentioned that Tony had this vision on a walk from Highgate to Parliament Hill, at the same spot, Boudicca's Tump, where the Moot 77 picnic was held. Many of the lay hunters of the 1960s and early 70s were introduced to the subject through flying saucers, and Paul briefly traced the line for us. In 1961, Jimmy Goddard and Philip Heselton were fired with enthusiasm for leys by Tony Wedd and formed the Ley Hunters Club in 1962. Outings and meetings were held, including one addressed by Alfred Watkins' son Alan, where he revealed that his father had been psychic. The Ley Hunter first appeared in 1965 and continued for 7 issues. A lecture by Jimmy Goddard introduced the subject to John Michel, the reluctant Merlin of Hippydom, as Paul described him, who more than anyone else had brought leys to the general consciousness of this country. It was certainly an article by John in International Times that really triggered Paul's response. It all makes sense. I know this. On hearing from Jimmy that the Ley Hunter had ceased publication, Paul decided to take on the task of editing the magazine himself. We were then given a quick survey of the magazine during the 7 years of Paul's editorship, from the early issues, strongly supported by Tony Wedd and Frank Lockwood, through the debate with Glyn Daniel and the refusal of a paid advertisement for the Ley Hunter in antiquity, as Crawford had refused many years before, via various threats of libel action from various quarters, to the establishment of a magazine of ever-increasing quality, with contributions from writers respected in their fields. Paul saw his function to act as a catalyst, encouraging articles to achieve a balanced overview. He particularly welcomed new writers, to avoid having a clique of regulars. By 1976, Paul felt that the magazine required a more technical type of production, if it was to continue and expand, with more people involved in it. He handed it over to Paul Devereux, who wrote this first article for the magazine back in May 1973, and considers that the way it has developed since he left has been quite remarkable. Tom Graves, author of Dowsing, Techniques and Applications and Needles of Stone, then spoke on dowsing and leys. He started by apologising for not living up to the traditional image of a dowser as being at least 60 years of age. Tom started teaching people to dowse in order to get someone to check his results, and it was from this that his first book emerged. He saw dowsing as tying in with the sides of ley hunting, where thinking at the moment was at its most woolly. Traditionally, the dowser looks for a web or pattern below ground. The dowser Bill Lewis, well known to ley hunters, pointed out that you pick up patterns above ground as well. Underwood, for example, never found these patterns because he never looked for them, but they were there. Tom called them overgrounds, forming a network of earth energy flowing in precisely straight lines between sites. Non-alignment, however, also seemed to be a feature of the system. Watkins' Lincoln-Holt-Fackham line, although not a ley by the classical definition, has been checked by a dowser in the field, and the line can be picked up with absolute precision. As Tom said, it was clear that there was something there, precisely what we don't know. Tom then outlined the main principles of dowsing. We were really limiting when it can work by our own beliefs, and quoted a writer who claimed that map dowsing would only work if you had no scars, no fillings, didn't wear glasses, and if you operated at midnight under a bare light bulb with no clothes on. As Tom said, we don't have those kind of limitations. Basically, dowsing was getting an instrument to react when what you are looking for coincides with where you are, but you have to ask the right questions unambiguously. Particularly in map dowsing, for leys, you have many layers of imagination to work with. The problem we have in ley hunting is that people are coming straight to a place with their ideas, lay them on the place and see them reflected back. Instead of screaming at the place, telling it what you want to see, how about stopping for a while and letting it tell you what's there, which is far more difficult, and I don't think any of us have got it right yet. I know I haven't. As a preliminary conclusion, Tom offered that we seem to have imaginary energies, entirely real, but at an imaginary level, not figments of a person's imagination, but rather part of the Earth's imagination. What we seem to have is a complete energy system, very similar to acupuncture in the landscape, and manoeuvred by shape, geometry, etc. Tom ended with a warning on the manipulation of the energies by putting in spikes and bypass loops. Seeing it as part of the energy system, we must be aware of the effect on the totality. Accidents have already occurred. We do not know what we are playing with. Now is the time for a lot more caution than we have been taking up to now. In introducing John Michell, Paul Devereux said simply that he suspected that most of us were there in the hall because of John's work. John gave us a personal account of how he became interested in the subject, the way it's developed for him, and where it might be leading. His first introduction to Watkins was through a lecture by Jimmy Goddard. After reading the old straight track, his reaction was, "How can this man introduce this entirely alien concept, write a whole book about this thing, to which there are no other references in modern literature?" After looking at a map, the whole thing flooded in on him. John saw the UFO origins of the modern consciousness of the landscape mystery as the beginnings of a new cosmology. One effect of the UFO phenomenon had been to draw attention to certain spots on the Earth's surface and the links between them. He quoted Evans Wentz, "There seem to be certain favoured places on the Earth where its magnetic and even more subtle forces are most powerful and most easily felt by persons susceptible to such things." He saw the origins of the recent ecology consciousness in the statement of early UFO contactees. He linked UFOs with folklore and quoted Lewis Spence. "All legends of the country amount to one great corpus of lost scientific knowledge, the knowledge of the Earth and its forces." He was glad that the folklore aspect was not being neglected in modern lay studies. The main objection to Watkins' ideas had been removed by Professor Thom's work, in that the megalith builders were shown to have knowledge of geometry, proportion and metrology. John saw the purpose of the geometrical design as being to order and to bring a corresponding pattern into the natural energies of the Earth. The criticism of John's The View over Atlantis had been that it failed to provide any proof of the deliberate existence of man-made alignment. For proof, it was necessary to establish that the megalith builders did in fact lay out straight lines, and he took an area of West Cornwall and thoroughly recorded the stones he found there. The extreme accuracy of the alignments put the matter beyond chance, and one could often predict where a stone would be likely to be found. Why were archaeologists so unwilling to accept the existence of the alignments? John put forward the idea of the cyclical view of history, as opposed to that of continuous progress, as exemplified by Hobbes, writing about the prehistoric peoples. They had no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear of death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The cyclical view has been repressed, but John thought that the survival of civilization depends on it. If you go too far away from contact with the realities of the universe, then you are going to be in trouble. John concluded his talk with an indication of the way the ancient peoples may have used the earth energy, fusing it with cosmic forces and spreading fertility, healing and prophecy about the country. Geoffrey Ashe, perhaps more than anyone else associated with Glastonbury, then gave a talk on the centres of wisdom. One of the influences of the Glastonbury Fair in 1971 had been the awareness of Glastonbury as a special place, and it was the awareness that there are special places that was the achievement of the ley hunting movement that he felt happiest about. The specialness of Glastonbury to Geoffrey Ashe, that it was alive and would be reborn, went back a long way. Some years ago he began a search, chronicled in his book The Ancient Wisdom, which he calls The Triumph of Objectivity over Wishful Thinking. He did not want the book to lead where it did. He wanted it to lead to Britain, which it did in the end, but by a more interesting route. Geoffrey echoed John Michel in challenging the idea of progress, going back to the older concept that essential wisdom was communicated to the human race some time ago by higher beings, and that it has been lost and recovered in parts. He set out to inquire whether there was anywhere on earth where the ancient wisdom began. Taking a clue from Madame Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophy, he saw that the number 7 was only sacred to the ancient peoples over part of the earth, and was linked with sacred centres. Each centre was a temple, said to be the centre of the world, such as the ziggurat at Babylon, the Rock of Zion in Jerusalem, and Delphi in Greece. There appeared to be an original centre, from which these were derived, a faraway mountain in the north, a country of the Hyperboreans. The Hindus talk about the same place, called Mount Meru. The Lamas of Tibet call it Shambhala. The place can be pinned down within a few miles. It's in the Altai Mountains, where Russia, China and Mongolia converge, near Mount Belukha. The Lamas earlier this century believed that Shambhala was still live. Apparently the Tunguska object came from the direction of the Altai Mountains in 1908, and in the 1920s Nicholas Roerich, who went in quest of Shambhala, saw what today would be called a UFO. Geoffrey Ash considers that he has established that there was a centre of wisdom there and that it is still active. As a final step, it has been claimed that the Glastonbury tour has a septenary maze around it, and it's modelled on Mount Meru. Glastonbury could be another centre, related to the Central Asia one. There appears to be some connection between the two, and some evidence that the Hyperboreans migrated. Stephen Jenkins, an initiate of the Shambhalic school of thought, was told that Shambhala is now in Britain. In support of this, Geoffrey pointed out that Glastonbury is on the same latitude as the Altai Mountains, and exactly a quarter of the way round the globe. They may both be part of a great system. Geoffrey Ash thinks that the original Shambhala may have gone wrong somehow, and that the mantle of the ancient Shambhala is now here. We now begin to see the magic, spell and power of Glastonbury in relation to other things, which we could never really do before, to begin glimpsing some extraordinary, almost unthinkable ancient system of which it was part, and which it perpetuates here today, if we care to listen. In the evening we gathered to hear Paul Devereux. Pulling together, a pulling together of people, a pulling together of disciplines, a pulling together hopefully of understanding. In this decade, lay hunting has shown its true colours as a bridge-building activity, creating an area of interdisciplinary investigation around itself that we are calling Earth Mysteries. Ley hunting is more of a door than a room, more of a track that leads somewhere than a destination. Earth Mysteries is a new melting pot, or rather a new cauldron of inspiration, from which a new mental soup is being cooked from ancient ingredients. To look back at the remote past and understand it, we are having to use both mental hemispheres, right and left. Right, intuitive, pattern sensing, leaps of understanding. Left, analytical, formalised, stage-by-stage cognition. These are the sexes of the psyche, and balancing them, uniting them with the divine art, it's necessary to awake Albion from his dread repose. There has to be a new mind to perceive the ancient mysteries. It's thus been a little disappointing to see the polite but noticeable disagreement developing in the columns and the mailbag of the Ley Hunter between those who feel we must be using only quantifiable methods of dealing with ley hunting and all its works, and those who feel only the intuitive reactions of the body are to be trusted. Either approach in isolation will dump us all back in the dark again. On the one hand, it's no good blazing trails if a good road surface is not put down for others to follow. On the other, it's equally as bad to be fussy about the dimensions and structure of the road if you have no direction for it to go in. It's both modes of mentality that must be harnessed together. The value of Earth Mysteries Cauldron to the world is that it's capable of a fresh mental approach to things that have remained hidden simply because they've been studied only in one way or the other. It's not a double approach, it's a unified one. There's only inspiration, and nature will chop and change the language of revelation to suit her needs. Science is only a language, as is only intuition a language. Let's speak in divers tongues. So let's pull together. If we do pull together people, approaches, disciplines, then we will have pulled together understanding, and we will have awoken Albion from his, to quote Blake, dread repose. Don Robbins then gave an account of his latest work in association with the Dragon Project on stone and its nature. Our quest for the identification of earth energy soon led us to consider monitoring an ancient site over an extended period of time, and we've been fortunate enough to acquire the use of the stone circle at Rollright through the interest of the owner, Pauline Flick. Since stones, whether as menhirs, circles or markstones, are central features of the ancient landscape and essential components of many alignments, measurement of energy manifestations at stones seem to be our natural starting point. In the last few decades, a considerable amount of work has been carried out, principally by Professor Alexander Thom, which has established that stone circles were laid out to sophisticated geometrical patterns, and that many stones served as an ancient astronomical function. The implications of this work, largely ignored or dismissed by the archaeological orthodoxy, were that ancient man possessed considerable mathematical skill, but the complex circles and astronomical alignments were so numerous that their sheer quantity argued for a more subtle and complex use beyond the calendrical or ritual ones. Beyond the measurements of the statisticians, however, folklore and legend recount many instances of stones associated with energy, stones moving, drinking at streams, and stones associated with healing, and it was to this whole shadowy area that the project addressed itself. To do this, however, required an insight into the nature of stone and the possible routes of energy storage and conversion, and we were fortunate to gain a number of unexpected insights from seemingly unrelated areas that helped us in our quest. There are many figures of speech which invoke the intractable nature of stone, and popularly these are borne out by the physical appearance of the stone. A look at the structure of the stone at a deeper level, however, reveals a totally different picture. I've described elsewhere the so-called defect structure of stone, which exists as an incomplete silicate lattice. This lattice, however, is not empty. Among other things, it contains a shifting population of trapped electrons, split from the lattice by ionizing radiation, either from radioactive elements in the lattice, from surrounding soil, or from cosmic rays that are trapped at imperfections in the lattice or in microcrystalline cavities. The electromagnetic energizing of the electrons can only occur within narrowly defined parameters. If the energy is too great, the electron will transfer it to the lattice. If too small, it will not be absorbed. The radiation which satisfies all criteria is microwave radiation, in that electrons can absorb it undergoing spin flip, that is, change of spin, and we may now consider how such energizing takes place. In looking for a natural low-level microwave source, we first considered the Sun. The Sun emits electromagnetic radiation through most of the spectrum, and the Earth's atmosphere blocks most of it, except for two important windows: the optical window, which allows through visible light, and the radio window, which allows wavelengths of about 1 centimetre to 30 centimetres through. The microwave region of interest is just at the edge of this optical window, and it might be postulated that at sunrise, when the disk is just clearing the horizon, the microwave region will be maximised, in that the shorter wavelengths visible and infrared radiation are only just clearing the horizon, whereas the longer wavelength radio waves are ineffective. A promising line of inquiry was opened up by considering the possibility of monitoring the transduction of the incident microwaves by the stone lattice to ultrasonic vibrations, in other words the classic piezoelectric effect. Such an effect could easily be monitored with standard equipment and less open to complicating factors, since few sources of ultrasound exist in the natural environment which could not be guarded against adequately. Accordingly, A detector was constructed for the project by Mike Roberts, and we began to monitor the site at dawn and at various other times. Apart from the stone circle, the King's Men, the Rollright site also includes the nearby King's Stone and the collapsed dolmen, the 5 Knights or Whispering Knights. Monitoring of ultrasonics was carried out at each of these stones or groups of stones, and also within a wide radius of the surrounding countryside, both before dawn and for several hours afterwards. Initially we gathered data on the intensity and duration of the ultrasonic effect. Our initial phase of monitoring in the autumn of 1978, before the hard winter brought our programme to an enforced halt for 2 months in early 1979, was interesting in that only the King's Stone and not the circle was observed to be active. It should be noted that the activity at the 5 Knights closely paralleled that of the King's Stone, but for reasons of space and simplicity these have been omitted. When monitoring resumed in 1979, however, the circle was found to be active, with different intensity levels out inside the circle, between the stone and on the stones themselves. The activity round the King's Stone generally extended some 40 or 50 yards in all directions, and then diminished rapidly. As the year progressed, we found the King's Stone activity diminished, whereas the circle activity increased, so that at the time of the vernal equinox, the circle became more active than the King's Stone. The general level of activity declined rapidly, then towards the solstice, and it has only now begun to re-emerge. This picture shows the King's Stone at Rollright, photographed from the northwest at dawn in April 1979. The film used was Kodak high-speed black and white infrared. A hazy glow can be seen clinging to the sides and upper parts of the megalith. This glow becomes much stronger at the top of the stone, where it looks like a cap of light. Going upwards into the sky at an angle, terminated only by the top edge of the frame, a subtle but definite band or ray of the luminescence can be detected. The effect has been recorded only round the King's Stone and only at dawn. Photographs taken earlier and later in the day, from exactly the same position, do not show the effect. At the circle itself, even at dawn, photographs of the stones taken against the sky have never recorded a similar effect. The glow has been recorded on several frames on 3 separate films taken on three different dawns. This is not an isolated effect. Conditions were clear for the picture, but a diffused glow effect has been photographed around the King's Stone, even in misty, foggy conditions. On Sunday morning, the first speaker was Mary Kane, who gave an illustrated guide to the Glastonbury zodiac. Mary started by explaining that it was natural in origin, that it was contoured by the hills, and that about half of it is outlined by streams, although a lot is man-made as well. It was discovered by a sculptor, Mrs. Maltwood, and the effigies can be seen as earth sculptures. Mary then went round and described the various figures with the help of aerial photographs. She showed how Glastonbury Tor looked like the effigy of a bald-headed eagle, how the Gemini figure was represented by 2 hills, with strip lynchets for the rib cage, and how both Virgo and Gemini were at least double figures. Weary-all Hill looked very much like the fish of Pisces. Mrs. Maltwood said that this zodiac circle is the origin of the mystique, the legends and the magic of Glastonbury, and somehow manages to enfold within itself all of Glastonbury's main legends, such as that of Gwyn ap Neath. Certain of the zodiac figures differ from those with which we're now familiar, but these are really changes of interpretation rather than form, such as the Aquarius bird, which is indeed also a water carrier, since Chalice Well springs from its beak. Mary then showed how the stars projected from a planisphere onto the map fitted the figures. She told the story of Joseph of Arimathea bringing Jesus here, and how he landed at the right place on the zodiac to show what he was doing, on the sign of Pisces. And that's why we have Glastonbury Abbey between Pisces and Aquarius, in exactly the right position for the dawn of the Aquarian age. This is really where it's all going to burgeon out from. Mrs. Maltwood was convinced that all the Arthur and Round Table stories came from this zodiac, and Mary gave examples of this from the Grail legends. In conclusion, Mary expressed the feeling that the zodiac is a divinely ordained pattern, and that they may be all over the country, although perhaps not stamped as heavily in some places as others. She feels that the forces of creation and their sequence of operation, the 12 steps, have stamped themselves on the ground, and that man goes on refining the zodiac, either consciously or unconsciously. John Glover then gave an illustrated talk on shadow paths. For most people, that is non-lay hunters, a ley is a very abstract thing. The discovery of the South American lines has helped enormously, but to grasp the reality of most leys, it's necessary to impose an imaginary line across the landscape, linking distantly placed objects and features that are not often even intervisible. And for those of us who can only sense leys with our eyes, this is not an easy task. There is little left on the ground, so to speak, to indicate an actual line, and if seeing is believing, something more is needed to convince the non-lay hunters than a row of points. Also, if something is to become accepted as being true, it must be seen to be true on all levels, so resistance to the lay theory may be due in part to the conditioning we all receive from childhood, that straightness is unnatural and artificial. Nature itself never ever constructs anything straight, so why should a culture so close to nature oppose its principles in such a dramatic way? But nature does use straight lines, and in ways that are readily apparent and highly symbolic. You only have to know how to look. At Castle Rig, I found a visible line on the ground that stretches from the circle down a valley away to the southeast. It's an extremely long shadow cast by the biggest stone in the circle that reaches its maximum height at the moment of sunset on Midsummer's Day. It shows that the megalith builders were acutely aware of the play of light and shadow across the landscape, and that they incorporated this knowledge into the design of the stone circles, not only to enhance their intrinsic beauty, but also as a recognition of a visual principle of straightness within nature that adds another dimension to the ley system. People seem drawn to this stone, no matter what time of day it is. A brilliant piece of sculpture in itself, for it shifts and changes shape as you walk around it. There are many tales of stones that move and dance, and this one certainly does, so when you move with sensitivity in relation to it, it has a motherly quality that a number of people have remarked on. Professor Tom found that it marks one end of a double astronomical alignment comprising the midsummer setting sun and Candlemas rising sun. It was during the Mediterranean summer of 1976 that I went to Castle Rig to photograph the midsummer alignment. As you stand behind a large stone, you see a ridge to the northwest of Castle Rig called Latrig, which provides a high false horizon that makes a right angle with the top of the large stone. This seems to focus on a natural mound on Latrig, producing the point at which the sun used to set when the circle was still new. As the sun approached nearer to this point, I became more and more intent, concentrating to get the photographs I wanted, when for no apparent reason I turned round. There at my feet was a wide dark shadow, extending for hundreds of yards in the direction of the notch marking the Candlemas rising sun. I was utterly amazed by this, and my first reaction was to run down it as fast as I could. I felt projected into one of those fairy tale situations when, if you are at the right place at the right time, a secret path appears to show you the way to the treasure. Perhaps the shadow path is the origin of such tales. In any event, I was able to contain myself long enough to take the photograph before the sun disappeared behind the trig and the shadow was gone. The question then arises as to whether the Castle Rig shadow path is an isolated phenomenon or can it be seen at other sites. So far I have photographed 2 events at other sites in the lakes that seem to provide confirmation of deliberate intention. Long Meg and her daughters is about an hour's drive from Castle Rig to the northeast. At the midwinter sunset, a shadow links Long Meg to her nearest daughter, and then spills over these to reach right across this very large circle to touch the stones on the other side. At Swinside, Professor Tom had noticed a sunrise alignment on January 13th, one of his megalithic months. This is observed in the circle through 4 stones that have been set to form an entrance, and as the sun rises, this time a path of light is revealed. Symbolically this is correct, as it marks out the onset of day and light, while the other 2 are sunset events and happen just before nightfall, hence the shadow element. After witnessing the sunrise at Swinside, I remembered that we already have a precedent within the megalithic culture for the use of a beam of light, and that is, of course, at New Grange. A deliberate gap in the circle at Swinside creates a dawn light path at midwinter solstice. Midwinter sunrise sunbeam on Castle Rig alignment. The same effect can be had by squinting the eye. Cover illustration on the Ley Hunter 77 by Anne Williams, inadvertently depicting a light path. Tony Roberts then introduced a slide and music presentation by Gail and Diana Tattersall, 2 Australian filmmakers. They've made a film called Forgotten Landscape, which is a summation of sites, how they react with one another, how they can be seen as a cosmic harmony throughout the world, as powerful centres of the imagination. The pictures captured the atmosphere of sites from the deserts of Australia to the megaliths of Britain, and blended well with the evocative music which accompanied them. The next to speak was Eugene Zimmer from Belgium on Some Bridges with the Continent. He was led into ley hunting, he thought, by the earth goddess herself, having lived in Wales during the war, and reading Robert Graves had led on to Watkins. He subsequently found leys in Belgium, read French writings on solstitial alignments and on sacred geography in Greece, whereby the country was divided into zodiacal zones. He also referred to a book on a zodiac at Verdun, in the south of France, discovered independently of Mrs. Maltwood's work. Zimmer had worked on solstitial alignments in South Brabant, where churches and shrines were aligned with rises in the horizon. He mentioned the tradition of looking to notches in the horizon to see what time of year it is, and told us how many places are still called point du jour, and are where farmers would go to point out the sun on the horizon. They are often at crossroads, the roads being aligned with the solstice points. In conclusion, he mentioned a French booklet on telluric currents in the form of a rectangular grid. The authors had found that megaliths would push the grid away from themselves, and that the vicinity of the megaliths was thus considered to be more healthy than elsewhere. Rose Hayward then spoke on the Chapel of St. Cross in Winchester. She put forward the idea of a part of a building being in special alignment, which she found at the Chapel of St. Cross. One window in the north transept was set on a semi-skew, and on Holy Cross Day, September the 14th, the sun shines through this window and strikes a pillar in a certain spot where a cross is carved. The relationship between St. Cross and St. Catherine's Hill was felt to be significant. One of the medieval windows was dedicated to St. Catherine of Alexandria, and there was a carving of the serpent and the cross at either side of the entry to the chapel. There was also a concentric circle pattern at the entry to the Beaufort Tower. Rose concluded by saying she didn't claim to be any dazzling revelations, just a line of inquiry to be followed up. St. Cross was well worth a visit, preferably approached via the water meadows. Paul then introduced John Steele as being one of the coordinators of the Dragon project, mainly responsible for the software side of the inquiry. His talk was entitled Direct Perception, the Invisible Dimension. John stressed that technological monitoring was not complete in itself. He was using the technology by going back to direct perception, seeing things without intermediate screens, such as psychics can, particularly sensing of energy fields. Some people can come to direct perception naturally, such as those who live intimately with nature, like the Aborigines of Australia, who have telepathy very highly developed. Living in Western civilization, we get a phenomenon called roof brain chatter from our subvocal voice. This is absent in people who live close to the Earth in areas of great external space, such as the aura is allowed to become supple and expand to its full width. Receptivity and balance between the hemispheres of the brain occurs, and a whole message is enabled to come through. This is not the case in an urban environment. As Don Robbins' University of Leicester work showed, concrete is officially dead. The capacity to turn off roof brain chatter also occurs in meditation. Emergent phenomena then occur, and you can tune in to the environment in this magical way. John spoke of the power to make visual images, which could be strong enough to manifest on the 3D plane, such as a false object being capable of detection by instruments or a dowser. Within a stone circle, a zero field effect, no ultrasonic reading, is sometimes obtained. At these times there is a clear channel within the circle, as if the ultrasonics had been absorbed by the stones. This perhaps allows the mind to enhance visualization, and perhaps to put out a message towards fertility, therapy, or prophecy. John felt that everything we do by machines we can do by ourselves eventually. Technology and direct perception were a continuum and complement each other. John then spoke of the Kundalini as being direct perception par excellence. He quoted Bentoff as saying that the magnetic field generated in the Kundalini process, radiated by the head, reacts with the fields in the environment as a transmitting and receiving antenna. The mechanism describes a possible next step in the evolution of the human nervous system, which can be accelerated by the use of certain techniques. This will increase awareness of the self as part of a larger system. Once the nervous system is turned on by this experience, direct perception will result. John concluded by stating his belief that early man who laid out the stone circles had this experience. Patricia Villiers-Stuart then spoke on the energy patterns of mazes. After introducing her talk with a fable called The Square, in which Eve makes God jealous by disobeying him, Patricia related how Mary Cain had introduced her to mazes in Norfolk by drawing one on the grass with a lawn tennis marker, which inspired her for life. In considering the labyrinth, there are two forms, the static framework and the energy pattern or path, and the aim is to show how the growth of the structure affects the shape of the energy pattern. In a similar way to a fetus or brain, diagrams of which strongly resemble the labyrinth. The structure is based on alternate coiling. Revealed to her in a dream the previous night, Patricia spoke about the cockleshell image, which can be created by the pattern of the square roots of numbers expressed in the circle and in spiral form, using Kabbalistic reduction. She spoke of the knowledge of the Knights Templars in this regard, and ended with the coining of a new word, astronosis, the wisdom of the stars. Donald Sire, the editor of Stonehenge Viewpoint, spoke on megalithic sites in America, although he started his journey in England with pictures of Burrow Mump and the cow that jumped over the moon. Moving on to America, Donald told us about some recent discoveries. Many Indian cave paintings have been found in California, some of which have been linked with the zodiac. There have been some evidence of astronomical alignments, and in some cases the sun shines through artificial openings in the caves, similar to New Grange. The location of many of the caves has been kept secret because of vandalism. Donald then showed pictures of Mystery Hill in New Hampshire, which has a series of pits, which archaeologists believe were root cellars built by colonists. They have, however, been dated by radiocarbon back to circa 2000 BC. There are many standing stones with Iberian Ogham writing, which align astronomically. He also referred to other standing stones in New England, which were being studied by the New England Antiquities Research Association, and considered that they are megalithic structures. Brian Larkman, in his talk Walbiri Ways of Seeing, showed the ways in which Australian Aborigines can see in a way that we can't, or only rarely. Many writers had referred to the similarity between Aborigine sand drawings and European cup and ring markings, and it's possible to interpret the Aboriginal experience into terms familiar to all lay hunters and dowsers. The Walbiri believe in ancestral beings who by their travels created the topography of the country. These ancestors are known as dreamings and are an everyday part of the environment, to be read and understood just as roads and footpaths are to us. The Walbiri designs are a form of the map of dreaming track, passing down the generations. The dreamings can only appear and alter the topography via a waterhole. They normally live below the Earth's surface. While above ground, they create paths, camps and features in the countryside, and at each place leave their generative powers. It is in effect the non-visible markings, in contrast to the visible markings of designs and topography, that the dreaming leaves in the soil and waterholes. At various times in the year, rituals are performed in certain areas, coinciding with the ancestors' camps, to maintain the balance of the forces within the area. In conclusion, Brian felt that the Walbiri were telling us about the structure and maintenance of space and time, describing a physical world with a non-material, etheric world superimposed on it and within it. He has never seen these ideas stated so clearly by an uncomplicated culture, let alone one using an iconography so similar to that of megalithic man. Jeremy Hart, in Sources of the Merlin Dragon Legend, approached an item of geomantic folklore from a different direction and took a single tale with some interesting features attached to one site and examined it in detail. The site is Dinas Emrys, near Bedgelart in Snowdonia, and the tale of its construction is first told in Nennius' History of the Britons. It tells of Vortigern's retreat from the Saxons, his search for a miraculous fatherless child, Ambrose or Emrys, who has powers to direct the finding of two buried dragons, the red one battling with the white, representing the Saxons, and driving it away. In a later version by Geoffrey of Monmouth, Ambrose becomes Merlin, and Jeremy showed how the story can be analysed by combining the elements of the churches built by night and the earthquake caused by animals motifs with that of the fatherless child, itself the descendant of rights of monarchy. What elements emerged over the weekend? 4 streams spring to mind. Firstly, the genuine way in which a variety of approaches were really pulling together. Secondly, the real beginnings of some sort of momentary glimpse across the culture gap into the minds of the megalith builders. We may yet learn something from them. Thirdly, the awareness is growing that we're not just dealing with an interesting period of the past, but that what we're discovering may be vital for the survival, not just of ourselves, but of the whole planet. Underlying and infused within these lies the 4th stream, that of the strange power of Glastonbury itself. The inspiration really did begin to flow, and who knows where it might lead. The beacon is certainly alight and is beginning to blaze.